Alright, if you've made it this far, you're probably as ready to be done with these eyes as I am. So let's put the last few finishing touches on and see about sticking them on a character. Since the last video, I've gone through and reviewed the entire setup and double-checked all my bone constraints and parent-child relationships and everything like that, and also added some new things as quality-of-life improvements. I've got a nice big list of things that I've done off-screen that we're going to go through really quick, and then we'll try taking this into a character file and attaching it to a Rigify rig. First, on the object level, I've parented the eye mesh to the rig object, so now it moves with it. And I've brought our reference plane and sphere in and parented them to the eye mesh, although we'll leave those off. But we want them there so that when we append this into a new file, they come along for the ride. And I've changed the name of our bend axes, just to make that clearer. Then, in the bones, I've changed the name of the root bone to be eye root, as it's going to be merged into a rig that already has a bone named root. On the eye control bone, I've locked the scale except for X, so that I can only scale side to side. The eye target bones have also been changed. They now have the eye control bone as their parent, and they have two copy location constraints. Before they had a copy location to the eye base and a copy transforms to the eye control. So now it's a copy location to the eye.l and a second copy location to eye control.l. The reason for this is otherwise you can get problems if you change the base pose of the rig so that this doesn't line up here anymore, and then apply this as a rest pose. Next, I've streamlined and cleaned up the scale depth offset fix driver. That was the one that we had in the nodes here. We had a bunch of mapping nodes next to our empties, like I've kept that one around, that have a driver in the Y location. I've done two things to improve that. First, I moved them inside our vector group so everything is in one place and we don't have to have a copy of them in each material. And second, the driver is no longer directly on the mapping node. Instead, like our lock rod and scale for the cat's lights, it's been added as a driver here. So this is a new property with the same exact driver copied and pasted into it, and then brought in as an attribute here. So all you have to do for that is add a driver and edit it, name it appropriately. You have to change the minimum value to go to -1 because otherwise it can't go below 0 and this value is below 0. And then you go to the old mapping node and you do a right click, copy driver, and you paste it into the new property. So we have a left and a right for those. I've also added custom properties that control the amount of bend in the bend lattices and the amount of iris displace. Let's take a look at how those work. Grab a driver window. If we reveal our bend lattices and go to their modifiers, we can see that there is now a driver controlling both the X and the Z on each lattice. That driver is a pretty simple expression. It is the IMES object's eye bend property, which we go here, we can see has a value of 50 typed into it. But that value is 50 radians by default, because even though Blender displays things as degrees, like in the modifiers here, the values it actually works with behind the scenes is radians. So we have to do a conversion from degrees to radians here, because I've typed in a large number. Well, technically it's from radians to degrees. But anyway, for this to be treated as 50 degrees and not as 50 radians, the expression is deg, which I've named this variable, times pi divided by 180. Setting up that driver is again fairly straightforward. I made the eye bend property, then you do a right click and you copy the data path. Or you can copy as new driver even. Then, if I had deleted this, I can paste it, and then it would give me the name of the property, change it to script expression, change that to deg, and then put the expression in here. And then just copy and paste that driver to all the other fields on both lattices. It is that easy. So now if I change this eye bend property on the eye mesh, we can see it adjusting how much it bends by. This doesn't move the central rotation point of the bone, so you'll still have to do that manually for now. Although it would be possible to make a more complex setup with more drivers or something that would automatically move this further back as it has less bend and closer as it has more, so that the rotation point is always in the right place. But since I don't want to make another 20-minute video, that'll have to wait for another time. The iris displace mount is a little bit more complicated, but it's the same basic idea. If we turn that up, then we have more displacement on our eyes if we want a different size. And I have made a slight change to the expression here. Again, I've brought this property in and called it disp for displace, and the way you do that is you can just copy data path, then add a input variable, target the object, and paste the data path, and there it is with the value. So that's how I got this. And then this expression used to be minus 0.002, but I've replaced that part of the expression with just disp, which is that value. A change was also necessary in the depth fix driver. This is the one that gets used inside the material. Similarly, I added displace, and this used to be the minus 0.002 times this, same expression, but then also plus 0.002 to balance it out at 0. And that actually meant that we had a bit of offset. So if you were changing the displacement, it was affecting the scale of the pupil by moving things back. So I removed that last part of the expression. So you should do that too, even if you don't set up the rest of this driver. So that's what's changed about this file. Now let's go ahead and try adding this and attaching it to a character. For this demonstration, I'll be using my Cybergirl character. She's rigged with Rigify and has a much earlier version of these same sorts of projected eyes. It's a little bit laggy if I move things around while rendering, but it's a complicated character. Even if your character doesn't use Rigify, don't worry, the fundamentals are going to be the same for pretty much any rig. If you built your own rig from scratch, I trust you will understand enough to figure it out, and if you're using one of the other common rigs, it'll be the same basic thing, it just might have slightly different bone names. Now she looks good and creepy. Next, it's time to append the eye setup. I'm going to select up here, and get to watch me run through my file system for a second. We're going to bring the whole projected texture eyes collection in. And that will come in at 0, 0, 0, but I just put my 3D cursor up there, snap it to the cursor, and move it forward on Y a bit. We can start positioning. The first thing to do is to position the eyes in the head. We'll do that using our eye left and right bones. A little bit of X translation, Z rotation, move back on Y a little bit. How well they fit is going to depend on the details of your eye socket geometry. I want to have it as far forward as possible, but I actually need to work on some of my eyelashes and this other stuff around these eyes. They're not perfect, so don't worry about that. And I'll render to double check the position. That is one of the downsides of these eyes, is that there isn't a good way to tell where they're looking if you're not rendering other than those empty objects. I'd like to find a solution to that in the future. Maybe some way to have a placeholder texture that displays even when you're not in rendered mode. I think there's ways to do that. Anyway, for the height, I was making the adjustment in object mode, although it doesn't really matter if I did it with the root bone either. It shouldn't make any difference because everything is linked together. So that seems to be correct. It's about where I want them. I'm not going to spend a ton of time tweaking them for this video. And they're looking around just fine. Because of our constraint setup on all the objects following them, we don't have to mess around with too much stuff. Next will be to apply this as the new base pose before we merge the rigs. I'm going to take the eye mesh now and unparent it with Alt-P and keep transform. So we don't want it to move. We only parented it to make it convenient to position with the rig. And I'm going to duplicate the armature, turn off the original one, and apply the duplicate. So now the pose is frozen to the mesh. And then on the rig, I will apply pose as rest pose. And that's still working, so it is ready to be merged into the main Rigify rig now. But first, let's pay attention to our layers. Here our control bones are in layer 1, and our other bones are in layer 2. But if I pull up the Rigify rig, we can see, first of all, there's a ton of stuff going on, because Rigify uses many layers. And then I have a bunch of custom stuff added to this rig, so I filled up most of these layers with that. So I want to make sure my eyes control bones go on the proper layer, which is the face layer, which is layer 1. And I want the secondary bones to go onto an empty layer so that I can find them. So I'll use that one. So I'll click back over to the eye rig, get these secondary bones. It's link selecting both rigs right now because they're both in pose mode. So let's put Rigify back into object and eyes into pose, secondary bones only, and move those to the second to the left of that block. And now when I merge, these will stay on the same layers. Now we can merge the rigs. I'll make sure I save the file first. Both are in object mode. I select the eyes, and then second I select the main rig, and I hit Ctrl-J. Those disappear because that layer is no longer on, but they are still there. Let's make sure that everything is still working. Yes, our eyes are working. But of course, if I go and turn on this layer and try moving the head, they're not attached. So let's attach them. Select our eye mesh, enable the armature modifier, retarget it to the new rig. And it still doesn't work because the bones aren't moving. We need to attach the eye's root bone to the head bone. So Rigify has its main deform bones over on that layer, and I'm just going to attach it straight to this Def Spine 006, the head bone, although I think I probably could attach it to one of the other... There's other bones on other layers that get the same motion as this, but it doesn't really matter. So let's get our root bone there, and shift select the head bone, edit mode, Control-P, keep offset. And now our eyes move with the head. Now there's another feature that Rigify has that I want to make sure our eyes have too. If you notice, as I move the head, our new eye control bones are moving, but the old eye control bones aren't. And that is because these have a property called eyes follow. When it's enabled, then the controller follows the head, and when it's disabled, the controller will stay in the same place regardless of how the head moves. This is useful if you want to have your eyes tracking to a certain target. So we actually have a bone in place to make that same behavior on our new eye setup already. That other bone is our eye tracker follow bone, which is next to our root. And we can turn off that now. Currently, it's copying the rotation and location of that bone. But if we turn both off, then as we move the head, the eye controls are no longer following the head, except for they will rotate a little bit because they are still tracking the root bone, but that's just to keep the distance between the eyes consistent. So what we need to make is a control to let us easily toggle those constraints on and off. Let's look at how that control works on our original eye controller bone. When we have this selected, we have eyes follow and mouth lock properties that appear here, whereas if we select different parts of the rig, we have different custom properties that appear. Rigify's interface is built by a script file that sits inside any file you create a Rigify Rig in, this UI file. When you open the file, it runs the script and that builds this control panel. And it does that based on the names of your bones. And these properties it's showing in this Rig Main Properties panel are custom properties that exist on the bone. So if we add a property called eyes follow to our new bone and we change it so that this is the eyes bone instead of this, we'll get this property showing up when we select our eye control bone. So let's take a look at how eyes follow is set up here. Minimum property value 0, default value 1 is overridable. We'll copy that, go to our bone here, add a custom property, name it the same thing. And now we see it under properties, but not rig main properties yet. But now I'll change this bone to be eyes old. I'll delete it after we are done with this setup. And this can be just eyes, and there it is. But note, it's 0 right now, and the other version, yeah, it had the field like this, where you could scrub it, or do that. So we want that behavior, and that's controlled by the property, where we just made the property value an integer, but let's make it a float by adding the 0.0. And now we get a different display. And since it has a minimum of 0 and maximum of 1, we can scrub it properly. Next, we'll add this to our constraints as a driver. I'll do a right click and copy as new driver. Go into our eye tracker follow bone, make sure both these constraints are enabled, and then paste it into the influence paste driver on both. And now, let's pose our head a bit. Currently it's not following because it's at 0, but then when we turn it up, now we can toggle the follow on and off. One more little thing we need to do is make sure that this eye tracker follow is parented to something. Otherwise, when it's off, it's just freely floating in the rig. So anything in the rig, if it's not parented to something else, should ultimately be parented to the root bone. So that's what we're going to do, and keep offset. That way, when we turn everything 180 degrees or something with the root bone, just do that, everything still works properly. I have to turn on my backlight so I can actually test and see things here. So now everything's fully turned around, but it's all still working. Oh, those backlight Eevee shadows are terrible. There we go. Much nicer. So now we'll hide these old eye bones, and let's just do a quick test to make sure things are working properly. If I put the head through some different rotations. When I was trying this earlier before this, I was doing this test and found some problems with the constraints, which is what I was fixing earlier. And that is all, does all seem to be working. Now, does it hold up if I rotate the root bone? Nothing should change as I rotate the root bone. Yep, still looking the same direction. Okay, but we have revealed a new issue, which is that we need to adjust our limit rotation bones for this character's eye size so that we can't do stuff that's, so that we can't do that. So those limit rotations are over here on these eye track bones. So I'm going to render, let's look down as far as possible. All right, so we don't really want it to go down that far. So now I can select this bone, and this is X, so the minimum, the minus is too much, I think. So yes, minus 20. Maybe minus 15, maybe, I'm not sure what a good rule is. I'll let it go just to the edge there. So let's let it go to minus 17, minus 16. So want the same on both sides, of course. I wish there was a way to mirror constraints. Maybe we'll get that one day. And now we'll check going up as well. And yep, that's going too far again. So maybe 18 looks right. Yeah, 18 will be fine, I think. And the reason these numbers are different is because the eyes aren't exactly centered on in the socket, but that's not unusual or necessarily wrong. That will depend on your eye shape. And now we'll do the same thing for left and right. That's actually looking better. Maybe... And I think that's actually okay. We'll leave that. And as I've mentioned previously, this limit rotation works well up and down and side to side, but it doesn't really work that well for diagonals. So I said we were doing it to solve this problem, but we can't solve it entirely. As I said when I talked about this before, there are some very advanced and complex things you can set up, and I'll link again to that Stack Exchange thread talking about them. So this is a problem you can solve if you really want to, but it's beyond the scope of this series. So there we go, actually. Our eyes are attached to the head and integrated into the rig. Depending on your character, you'll want to parent the eye mesh to something. I have a empty that controls all the meshes in this object, so I'd parent it to that, and I'd add this collection in, so you'll have to do that for whatever's appropriate for your character. So that wasn't too bad, actually. Now let's talk about a few other adjustments you might want to make for any given character. So let's recap some of the very basic usage stuff, since it's been a long time since those early videos. If you wanted to change the iris depth or the eye bend, then you'd use those custom properties that we just set up. They are, of course, still working in this new file, which is super convenient. Remember, if you change the bend, you do need to move the position of the bones, the rotational bones. And if you want to change the size of the iris or pupil, that's done in the shaders. Go into the iris material, go into our area masks group, and make changes to our mask from gradient nodes that control the size of the textures. So if we go to, say, 0.8, that gets smaller, 0.85 is even smaller, etc. And that can be done for whatever parameter you need. So if you change the scale of, say, the bone and then apply it to the rig, that doesn't actually alter the empties. So remember that. It has to be changed in the material. If your character was a totally different scale from mine, then it is a tricky situation. There isn't an easy way to just scale everything because some parameters are from the rig and the object and some are in the materials. So if you have a very different scale, then you're going to have to go through and maybe re-watch this on ×2. And in those early videos where we're first building things, you'll have to multiply a bunch of the numbers by, ×10 for 10 times the scale or whatever. So if that's your situation, then my recommendation is that you size your character down to use the standard size of 1 Blender unit equaling 1 meter, which is what we built the eyes for. But I know some game engines use like 100 times the scale, and there's various considerations. But yeah, that's beyond the scope of this series. There, we'll just go with that. I was also asked about if there would be any issues that would come up using multiple of this setup on different characters being linked into the same scene. And the answer is that on a object level, everything will be fine. If you had, say, 2 different characters in their own files that you put these eyes on both of them and you link them both into the same scene, you won't have any issues. Where you could run into issues is if you have multiple characters in the same file. And of course, if you want to use these materials and, say, link the material from one file into both characters and then have them have different eye textures, since we don't have that many of the parameters exposed. The area mask file has a bunch of these settings for the eyes inside it, and of course that's only going to apply to that character. So if you had multiple characters in the same file or something, you would need to copy the area mask group for each one, as well as the rest of the eye material, because you're going to have different object inputs for each. But if you're working with each character has its own file and you have a just one character per file, you won't have any trouble. Okay, I think that's everything working now, so let's have some fun. I'll load a pose so we can see what it looks like in action. And my hair rigging is crazy, so I've left it as multiple separate rigs. That. And let's get the props. Now, of course, my new eyes aren't actually in the right place because since they're not part of the pose saved in the pose library, they didn't go there. So I've left the old eye controller so that I can snap the new one to it. And now they're in the right place. And now the old one can go away. And let's test it tracking the camera. I've jumped into my camera view, and let's take our eye bone, toss on a copy location, and the camera. Now the eyes are looking at the camera. This is going to be pretty laggy, but it does work. And because of our rotation offset, it actually follows pretty well. Until we run into those weird rotation limit areas. And if we really want to murder the performance, let's get out of the camera. And I can enable all the subserves. Oh, man. Now it looks very nice. So that is the end. It is done. We built it. We learned a lot. We added to the character. So I think we can call that a successful project. But of course, projects don't ever really end. There's still plenty of features that could be added to this eye setup. I hope in the future to take a look at things like consolidating the modifier stack by replacing a lot of it with geometry nodes, maybe reducing the amount of empties needed by using drivers and attributes instead. I think there's a way you can target the bones directly without needing the empties, and maybe set up some of the automatic adjustment of the fake sphere size, solve some of those mapping issues so that our pupil isn't just overlaid over the iris, but that we actually get some interpolation between them. And I think I can get it working on non-curved geometry as well, or inconsistently curved if we need it for even funkier eyes. So there's a lot that can still be done, but I'm pretty fed up with eyes for the time being, so that can wait to the next character. I would like to give a thank you and a shout out to Collupsy, the creator of the prop driver add-on, which has gotten an update, as I mentioned. I'll link that in the description again, so go ahead and check it out. And also a big thank you to all my patrons and everybody who's purchased the file so far. And a big congratulations to anybody who actually made it through this whole series, especially if you followed along and built the whole setup yourself. If you didn't, but you want it, remember, you can just pick it up on Gumroad for a few dollars and help support me at the same time. Of course, I welcome any questions and feedback, especially if you find some major flaw in this or some way to break it, then I will try to do a follow-up video to address any problems you can find. Also, any feedback you want to give is very welcome. I know this has been a really long, dense tutorial, so that's not, the most popular thing, but pretty much everything that can be covered in a convenient 5 to 10 minute tutorial has already been covered by somebody else, so I'm aiming for some of that more dense content. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next project.